The orphanage sat quietly at the edge of town, surrounded by fields that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. Its weathered walls bore the marks of time, their pale yellow paint peeling in soft curls under the relentless touch of the sun. Children's laughter rang through the crisp air, weaving through the chatter of birds perched on the swaying branches of the lone oak tree in the yard. Inside, Miss Evelyn bustled about, her warm presence anchoring the chaos of a dozen small, hopeful lives. Among them was 7-year-old Liam, a boy with bright green eyes that sparkled with curiosity. His untamed brown curls often fell across his face, giving him the mischievous appearance of a boy always on the brink of discovery. Today, Liam sat cross-legged on the porch steps, his small fingers fiddling with a delicate necklace that dangled from his neck. The pendant, a small silver heart, glinted in the sunlight, etched with words he couldn't quite understand. To Liam, the necklace was a treasure, a whisper of the mother he had never met. "My mom said you gave her this," Liam would often whisper to the pendant, as though speaking to it might unlock its secrets. The day had started like any other until the large, black SUV pulled up outside the orphanage gates. Its polished exterior stood in sharp contrast to the chipped wood and weathered bricks of the orphanage. The driver stepped out first, a tall, suited man who opened the back door with practiced precision. Out stepped Alexander Blake, a man whose presence seemed to still the world around him. His sharp, tailored suit and the gleam of his expensive watch marked him as someone far removed from this humble place. Alexander was known for his calculated demeanor, a man who rarely spared emotions in his decisions. His name was synonymous with success, his company a towering symbol of achievement. But as he stood at the gates, his steely gray eyes scanned the orphanage with a flicker of something unspoken, a discomfort that he quickly masked. "Welcome, Mr. Blake," Ms. Evelyn said warmly, extending a hand. "It's an honor to have you here. The children are thrilled to meet you." Alexander shook her hand, offering a tight-lipped smile. "Let's not overstate it. I'm here for the initiative, not a meet and greet." His voice was calm, deliberate, and without warmth. Despite his clipped tone, Miss Evelyn maintained her cheerful demeanor. "Still, your presence means a lot to us. Shall we?" As they moved through the yard, children gathered in clusters, their curious eyes peeking out from behind trees and corners. Liam, however, didn't hide. He approached Alexander directly, his small frame dwarfed by the man's imposing figure. "Hi," Liam said simply, tilting his head to study Alexander. "Are you important?" The question caught Alexander off guard, and for a moment he struggled to find an answer. "I suppose some people think so," he replied, his tone flat. Liam frowned, unimpressed. "You don't look very fun." His eyes drifted to the shiny watch on Alexander's wrist before flickering back to his face. "Do you always wear that?" Ms. Evelyn intervened, chuckling nervously. "Liam, Mr. Blake is a very busy man. Why don't you go play?" But Liam didn't move. Instead, he clutched the necklace around his neck and stared at Alexander. "You remind me of someone," he said softly, almost to himself. Alexander's eyes were drawn to the necklace. The sight of it seemed to drain the color from his face for the briefest of moments. He recovered quickly, but the reaction was not lost on Ms. Evelyn, or on Liam, who now regarded him with a quiet intensity. "Excuse me," Alexander muttered, stepping away. He turned toward the main building, his mind racing. The image of the necklace burned into his thoughts, tugging at memories he had long buried. Liam watched him go, his small hand tightening around the pendant. "He looks scared," he murmured, more curious than ever. From the doorway, Miss Evelyn sighed, her eyes following Alexander's retreating figure. Something about this man, she thought, didn't quite add up. The orphanage buzzed with activity, but Alexander seemed untouched by the warmth around him. He walked briskly through the halls, his shoes echoing off the tiled floors, his mind preoccupied. That necklace, it was impossible. It couldn't be the same one. Could it? He clenched his jaw, pushing the thought away. Coincidences happened all the time. That's all this was. Back outside, Liam had returned to the steps, though his gaze kept drifting toward the main building where Alexander had disappeared. He wasn't sure why, but something about the tall man intrigued him. He turned to his friend, Sarah, a girl with fiery red hair and a knack for asking questions as bold as Liam's. "Did you see his face when he looked at my necklace?" Liam asked, twisting the pendant between his fingers. Sarah shrugged, balancing a skipping rope in her hands. "He probably thought it was shiny. Rich people like shiny things, right?" Liam frowned. "No, it was more than that. He looked like he knew it." Sarah rolled her eyes. "You're imagining things. Grown-ups are weird. Come on, let's play." But Liam wasn't listening. Instead, he stood up, a determination settling in his small frame. "I'm gonna ask him," he announced. Sarah dropped her rope. "Ask him what?" "If he's met my mom," Liam said simply, as if the answer were obvious. Sarah stared at him, wide-eyed. "You can't just ask people stuff like that. Miss Evelyn says not everyone's nice." Liam gave her a lopsided grin. "He doesn't look mean, just sad." Inside, Alexander found himself in Ms. Evelyn's small office. The space was cramped, with shelves overflowing with books, binders, and the occasional craft project from the children. A framed photo of Ms. Evelyn with a group of beaming kids sat on her desk. She poured 2 cups of tea and placed one in front of Alexander, who barely acknowledged it. "Mr. Blake," she began gently, taking her seat. "Are you all right? You seemed a bit distracted earlier." Alexander leaned back in the creaky chair, his hands clasped tightly. "I'm fine, just a long day." She studied him for a moment, her eyes kind but sharp. "You know, people often come here thinking they're doing us a favor, and sometimes they're right, but occasionally it's the other way around." He raised an eyebrow. "What's that supposed to mean?" Ms. Evelyn smiled softly, folding her hands on the desk. "Sometimes people find answers here, answers they didn't even know they were looking for." Before Alexander could respond, there was a soft knock at the door. Liam peeked in, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Liam," Ms. Evelyn said, her tone both surprised and slightly exasperated. "What did I say about knocking before entering?" "Sorry, Ms. Evelyn," Liam replied, not sounding sorry at all. His attention was fixed on Alexander. "Can I talk to him, just for a minute?" Alexander blinked, caught off guard. "Me? What for?" Liam stepped inside, his small hands clutching the necklace again. "You looked at this earlier," he said, holding it up for Alexander to see. "Do you know it?" Alexander's breath hitched. The pendant swayed slightly in the air, catching the light. It looked identical to the one he had given Clara all those years ago. His fingers twitched, but he forced himself to remain composed. "No," he said after a moment, his voice quieter than he intended. "I don't know it." Liam frowned, clearly unconvinced. "Are you sure? My mom said it was important. She told me to keep it safe." Alexander stared at the boy, his carefully constructed facade starting to crack. "What else did she say?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Liam shrugged. "Not much. Just that one day I'd understand." The words hit Alexander like a punch to the gut. He swallowed hard, suddenly feeling the walls of the small office closing in around him. "Excuse me," he muttered, standing abruptly. "I need some air." He left the room in long strides, his heart pounding. Behind him, Liam watched, the same curious expression on his face. Miss Evelyn sighed, placing a gentle hand on Liam's shoulder. "Why don't you give him some time, sweetheart? Adults don't always know how to handle big feelings." Liam tilted his head. "What big feelings?" Ms. Evelyn smiled faintly. "Sometimes it's hard to tell if they're scared or sad, or both." Outside, Alexander stood in the cool air, his hand gripping the edge of the railing for support. The boy's words echoed in his mind, pulling at memories he had long buried. "Clara," he whispered to himself, the name tasting foreign yet familiar on his tongue. Could it really be her? Could Liam? His thoughts trailed off, leaving only silence and the distant sound of children laughing. Alexander remained outside, staring out at the orphanage grounds, his grip on the railing tightening. The distant laughter of the children felt surreal, like it belonged to another world entirely. His mind raced back to memories he had tried to suppress, the last time he had seen Clara, the argument that had ended everything, and the necklace she had pressed into his hand before walking away. "You'll understand someday," she had said through tears, "but I can't wait for you anymore." He hadn't understood then, and he wasn't sure he understood now, but that necklace, the same one the boy had been clutching, was unmistakable. A cold shiver ran down his spine. Inside, Liam had returned to the yard, but his thoughts lingered on Alexander. He sat under the oak tree, running his fingers over the engraving on the back of the pendant. "Forever, Clara." The words were a mystery to him, but they felt important, like a secret waiting to be uncovered. He remembered the way Alexander had reacted, the flicker of something in his eyes. Grown-ups were strange, Liam decided. They always hid things. Nearby, Sarah leaned against the tree trunk, chewing on a piece of gum she had borrowed from Ms. Evelyn's desk. "You really think he knows your mom?" she asked, her skepticism evident. Liam shrugged. "Maybe." He acted like he did. Sarah blew a bubble and popped it loudly. "What if he's just some rich guy? Why would he know anything about your mom?" "Because," Liam said, as though it were obvious, "he looked at the necklace like it scared him." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Maybe he just doesn't like jewelry." Liam shook his head, more convinced than ever. "I'm going to figure it out. I just need to talk to him again." Meanwhile, Miss Evelyn found Alexander leaning against the porch railing, his expression distant. She approached him cautiously, sensing that he was wrestling with something heavy. "Mr. Blake," she said softly, "are you sure you're all right? You've seemed unsettled since you got here." Alexander turned to her, his face carefully neutral, but his eyes betrayed him. "I'm fine," he said curtly, then hesitated. "That boy, Liam, what do you know about him?" Ms. Evelyn tilted her head, surprised by the question. "Liam? He's been here since he was a baby. Someone left him on our doorstep with nothing but that necklace and a note. No other family ever came forward." Alexander's heart sank. "The note? What did it say?" "It wasn't much, just a few words. Please keep him safe." Ms. Evelyn sighed. "We've tried to find out more, but there wasn't much to go on. He's a wonderful child, though, full of life, always curious, but he's never stopped wondering about his mother." Alexander swallowed hard. The pieces were falling into place, but they painted a picture he wasn't sure he could face. If Liam was Clara's child, his child, what did that mean? Why hadn't she told him? Why had she left him here? Ms. Evelyn studied him closely. "You seem particularly interested in Liam. Is there something you're not telling me?" Alexander hesitated. Every instinct told him to brush off the question, to retreat behind the wall of detachment he had built over the years. But the look in Ms. Evelyn's eyes, the quiet wisdom of someone who had seen it all, made him pause. "I think," he began, his voice unsteady, "I think I might know something about his mother." Miss Evelyn's expression softened, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Mr. Blake, if there's anything you can tell us, anything that could help Liam, it would mean the world to him." Alexander nodded, though the weight of what he had to say threatened to crush him. "I just need some time," he said finally, his tone pleading. Miss Evelyn placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Take all the time you need, but I hope for Liam's sake you'll find the answers you're looking for." As she walked away, Alexander remained rooted to the spot. He stared down at his hands, remembering the last time they had held that necklace. His world was unraveling, and for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if he had the strength to hold it together. Inside, Liam peeked through a crack in the door, watching Alexander from a distance. The man looked lost, Liam thought, almost like he didn't know where he belonged. And for reasons he couldn't explain, Liam felt like he needed to help him find his way. The sun began its slow descent over the orphanage, casting long shadows across the yard. Children ran and played, their laughter bouncing off the walls. But Liam was quiet. He sat on the steps again, his necklace resting in his palm, and stared at the horizon. His thoughts lingered on Alexander, the man who seemed to know more than he let on. "I'm going to talk to him again," Liam said aloud, though no one was there to hear. He stood and dusted off his shorts, his small jaw set with determination. Inside, Alexander sat in the office Miss Evelyn had offered him to collect his thoughts. The room was dim now, the only light coming from a lamp on the desk. He had spent hours avoiding what was staring him in the face, but the silence of the room forced him to confront it. Clara. The name hung in his mind like an echo, pulling him back to a time he had worked so hard to forget. The memory was vivid. Clara had been everything Alexander wasn't, light where he was shadow, heart where he was ambition. She had believed in him when no one else did, standing by his side as he struggled to get his business off the ground. He had promised her the world, and for a while she believed him. But promises had a way of breaking under the weight of ambition. "You've changed, Alex," Clara had said that night, tears brimming in her eyes. "I thought we were building a life together, but all you see is your work. I don't even know who you are anymore." "You don't understand," Alexander had snapped, his voice colder than he meant it to be. "I'm doing this for us, Clara, for our future." She had shaken her head, her voice trembling. "What future? There's no room for me in your plans, and now there's no room for us." She had pressed the necklace into his hand, her fingers lingering for a moment. "One day," she had whispered, "you'll understand what really matters. But I can't wait for that day, Alex. I need more than promises." And then she was gone. Alexander ran a hand through his hair, the memory cutting deeper now than it had back then. The thought of Clara leaving had been painful, but the thought of her doing so while carrying his child? That was a weight he hadn't prepared for. A soft knock at the door broke his reverie. Alexander straightened, clearing his throat. "Come in." The door creaked open, and there stood Liam, his wide green eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and determination. He stepped inside, letting the door close behind him, and walked over to the desk where Alexander sat. "Do you have a minute?" Liam asked, his voice small but steady. Alexander hesitated, then nodded. "Of course." Liam climbed into the chair across from him, his feet barely reaching the edge. For a moment, he simply stared at Alexander, as though trying to figure him out. Then he reached up and held out the necklace again. "This is my mom's," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She told me to keep it safe. She said it was important." Alexander's eyes locked onto the pendant, his composure faltering. "I see," he said, his voice strained. "Do you know her?" Liam asked directly, his gaze unwavering. Alexander's throat tightened, How could he explain this to a child? How could he tell him the truth without unraveling everything? He forced himself to meet Liam's gaze. "I knew someone who had a necklace like that," Alexander admitted, choosing his words carefully. "A long time ago." Liam's face lit up with hope. "Was it my mom?" The question hung in the air, heavy with possibility. Alexander opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. He looked into Liam's eyes so much like Clara's, and felt the walls he had built around himself begin to crumble. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "But maybe we can find out. Together." Liam's small face broke into a smile, and for the first time since arriving at the orphanage, Alexander felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Hope? From outside the room, Miss Evelyn watched through the crack in the door, a knowing smile playing at her lips. She didn't know what was unfolding between the boy and the CEO, but she had a feeling it was something that could change both their lives forever. The next morning, the orphanage hummed with its usual rhythm of activity. Children ran through the hallways, chasing each other with uncontainable energy, while Ms. Evelyn moved between the kitchen and the office, ensuring everything was in order. But Alexander was unusually still. He sat on a bench near the oak tree, lost in thought, as Liam wandered up to him, clutching the necklace as always. "Good morning," Liam said, plopping down beside him without waiting for an invitation. Alexander looked at him, the edges of his mouth twitching into the faintest semblance of a smile. "Good morning." Liam tilted his head, studying him. "You look tired." Alexander gave a short laugh. "That's because I didn't sleep much." "Me neither," Liam replied, swinging his legs back and forth. "I kept thinking about what you said, about finding out more. Did you think about it too?" Alexander hesitated. He had thought about it more than he cared to admit. The pieces were falling into place, but every answer brought with it more questions. Why had Clara left Liam at the orphanage? Why hadn't she reached out to him? And most pressing of all, if Liam really was his son, what did that mean for their future? "I did think about it," Alexander finally said, "and I think we need to look for some answers together." Liam's face brightened. "Really?" Alexander nodded, but his voice carried a note of caution. "It might not be easy, Liam. Sometimes answers aren't what we expect." "I don't care," Liam said earnestly. "I just want to know." Alexander studied the boy, his determination both admirable and heart-wrenching. "Then let's start with the necklace," he said. "Do you know anything else about it?" Liam frowned, twisting the pendant in his fingers. "Not much, just what Ms. Evelyn said. I've had it as long as I can remember. My mom left it with me when she went away." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow, but he kept his expression steady. "Do you know why she went away?" "No," Liam said, his voice quieter now. "But I think it was because she wanted me to be safe." Alexander swallowed hard, his chest tightening. Clara had always cared about safety, about creating a secure environment for those she loved. If she had left Liam here, it had to have been for a reason. Ms. Evelyn approached them then, holding a faded envelope in her hands. "Good morning, Mr. Blake. Liam?" She smiled warmly, but her tone carried a hint of gravity. "I thought you might want to see this." "What is it?" Liam asked, leaning forward. Ms. Evelyn handed the envelope to Alexander. "This was left with Liam when he arrived. We've kept it safe all these years, but we could never make much sense of it. Maybe it'll mean something to you." Alexander's hands trembled slightly as he took the envelope. It was old, the edges worn and yellowed with time. He opened it carefully, his heart pounding. Inside was a single note, written in a hurried, slanted hand. "His name is Liam. Please take care of him. C." Alexander stared at the note, his vision blurring. The handwriting was unmistakably Clara's. His grip on the paper tightened as emotions he had buried for years surged to the surface. "Is that from my mom?" Liam asked, his voice filled with wonder. Alexander looked at him, struggling to find the right words. "Yes," he said at last, his voice thick with emotion. "It's from your mom." "What does it say?" Liam pressed. Alexander hesitated, then read the note aloud. When he finished, Liam was silent, his small hands clutching the pendant tightly. "She wanted me to be safe," he said softly, as though confirming something he had always believed. Alexander nodded. "She did. More than anything." Liam looked up at him, his green eyes shining. "Do you think she wanted me to find you too?" Alexander didn't answer immediately. Instead, he folded the note carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. "Maybe," he said finally, "maybe she did." But inside, he already knew the truth. Clara had left Liam here not just to protect him, but to give Alexander a chance to find him when he was ready. And though it had taken years, Alexander felt in that moment that he was finally ready. Ms. Evelyn placed a hand on Alexander's shoulder. "If you want to know more, I can help. There are people who might remember Clara from when she brought Liam here." Alexander met her gaze, gratitude softening the lines of his face. "I'd like that," he said quietly. As Ms. Evelyn walked away, Liam leaned against Alexander's side, his small frame warm and steady. For the first time in years, Alexander felt something he hadn't realized he was missing, the quiet comfort of connection. The day passed in a blur of small moments, children playing, Ms. Evelyn moving about with her endless tasks, and Alexander drifting between helping where he could and losing himself in thought. But by late afternoon, Ms. Evelyn returned with a worn folder in her hands. It was thick with papers, yellowed and curling at the edges, and she carried it as though it held the weight of many untold stories. "I thought you might want to see this," she said, placing the folder on the table where Alexander and Liam sat. "What is it?" Alexander asked, his voice low. "It's everything we have about Liam's arrival," Ms. Evelyn explained. "We've kept detailed records on all the children who've come through our doors. It's not much, but there might be something in here that helps you understand what happened." Liam perked up, his curiosity piqued. "Can I look too?" Ms. Evelyn smiled at him. "Of course, sweetheart. It's about you after all." Liam scooted closer, and together he and Alexander opened the folder. The first page was a simple intake form listing Liam's name, approximate age, and the date he had been brought to the orphanage. The lines for parents or guardians and known family members were blank. Alexander's jaw tightened as he turned the page. There was a short, typewritten note from a social worker describing how Liam had been found, left in a small basket at the orphanage's doorstep in the middle of the night. The only items left with him were a soft blanket, the necklace, and the note Alexander had read earlier. "That's my blanket," Liam said, pointing at a blurry black and white photograph of the basket and its contents. "I still have it." Alexander felt his chest tighten. The image of the basket, left on the cold porch under the cover of darkness, brought an ache to his heart he hadn't expected. Clara had always been brave, but the thought of her walking away from her child, of her being forced to make that choice, was unbearable. "Why did she leave me?" Liam asked suddenly, his voice small and uncertain. Alexander hesitated, searching for the right words. "I don't think she wanted to leave you," he said carefully. "I think she had to keep you safe." Liam considered this, his fingers brushing the pendant around his neck. "Did she know you?" he asked, looking up at Alexander with wide, hopeful eyes. Alexander sighed. "Yes," he admitted, his voice heavy. "I knew her a long time ago. She was someone very special to me." "Did you love her?" Liam asked, his tone innocent but piercing. The question caught Alexander off guard. He stared at the boy, seeing Clara in every detail of his face. Finally, he nodded. Yes, I loved her very much. Liam's face softened, and he leaned against Alexander's arm. I think she wanted me to find you. Alexander couldn't bring himself to answer. Instead, he turned another page in the folder, revealing a handwritten note tucked between the records. It was on plain paper, folded into a neat square. Carefully, Alexander opened it. The note read, To whoever finds him, I love my son more than anything in this world. Please give him a safe and happy home. I can't stay, but I hope one day he will understand. And if he ever meets Alexander Blake, tell him, I'm sorry. The words blurred as Alexander's vision clouded with tears. His fingers tightened around the note, and he had to take a deep breath to steady himself. What does it say? Liam asked, his voice full of wonder. Alexander wiped his eyes quickly, not wanting the boy to see him cry. It's from your mom, he said, his voice trembling slightly. She wanted you to know how much she loved you. Liam smiled softly, a quiet happiness settling over him. I already knew that. Alexander's heart clenched at the simplicity of the boy's faith. He looked back at the note, rereading Clara's words over and over. The apology she had left for him was like a dagger, cutting through his carefully constructed armor. Ms. Evelyn returned then, breaking the silence. There's someone you should talk to, she said gently. A social worker who was here when Liam arrived. She might remember more. Alexander nodded, folding the note and placing it carefully back into the folder. Thank you, Miss Evelyn. I'll talk to her. As Miss Evelyn left, Liam turned to Alexander, his eyes bright. Do you think she'll know more about my mom? Alexander placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. I think it's worth finding out. And no matter what we learn, Liam, I promise you this, you're not alone, not anymore. Liam smiled up at him, and for the first time in years, Alexander felt the beginnings of something unfamiliar. Hope. Together, they would uncover the truth. Whatever it was, they would face it as a team. The next morning, Alexander and Liam prepared for their meeting with the social worker Ms. Evelyn had mentioned. Liam was brimming with excitement, his small legs bouncing under the breakfast table as he ate. Alexander, however, felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. He wanted answers, but he wasn't sure he was ready for what they might reveal. By late morning, they arrived at the modest office of the social worker, a middle-aged woman named Margaret Parker. Her kind face and steady demeanor immediately put Liam at ease, though Alexander remained guarded. Margaret greeted them warmly, offering Liam a lollipop from a jar on her desk before settling into her chair. I remember the night Liam arrived like it was yesterday, Margaret began, her tone thoughtful. It's not every day you see a mother make such a difficult choice. Alexander leaned forward, his jaw tightening. You saw her? Clara? Margaret nodded. She didn't leave the boy at the door and run away, like some do. She waited until I came out to check on a noise. She wanted to make sure someone would take him inside. She handed me the basket herself. Alexander's heart pounded. Did she say anything? Anything at all? Margaret took a moment, her expression tinged with sadness. She didn't tell me much. She seemed desperate, like she was running out of time. She said her name was Clara, and she begged me to keep Liam safe. She wouldn't explain why she was leaving him, only that she had no choice. Liam listened intently, his wide eyes darting between Margaret and Alexander. Did she say anything about me? He asked. Margaret smiled gently at him. She said you were her whole world. She kissed your forehead before she left and told me to make sure you always knew how much she loved you. Liam's small hand reached for his necklace, clutching it tightly. She sounds nice, he said softly. She was, Margaret agreed. Then, turning to Alexander, she added, She seemed worried, though, like she was afraid someone might come looking for her. Alexander stiffened. Afraid? Of what? Margaret hesitated. She didn't say, but she asked me not to tell anyone where the boy was. She said it wasn't safe. Alexander frowned, his mind racing. Clara had always been strong, unshakable, even in the face of adversity. For her to have been so afraid, something must have happened. But what? Margaret opened a drawer and pulled out an old notebook. Flipping through the pages, she found a specific entry. I wrote down everything I could remember that night, just in case. She mentioned something about leaving for Liam's sake, to give him a chance, she said. And then, right before she walked away, she said this: "If Alexander Blake ever comes looking, tell him I had no other choice." The words hit Alexander like a thunderclap. He stared at Margaret, his breath caught in his chest. "She said my name?" Margaret nodded. Clear as day. Liam turned to Alexander, his eyes full of questions. "She knew you'd find me," he said, his voice full of quiet certainty. Alexander felt the weight of those words settle on his shoulders. Clara had left Liam with the hope that he would one day step up, be the man she had believed he could be. And though he had failed her once, he was determined not to fail her again. "Is there anything else?" Alexander asked Margaret, his voice steadier now. "Anything that might help us understand why she left?" Margaret shook her head. "I wish I knew more, but whatever her reasons, she loved that boy with all her heart. That much was clear." Alexander nodded, gratitude mingled with regret. "Thank you. You've helped more than you know." As they left the office, Liam walked close to Alexander, his small hand slipping into his larger one. Alexander glanced down at him, struck by the trust in the boy's eyes. "Do you think we'll ever find her?" Liam asked quietly. Alexander hesitated, his throat tightening. "I don't know, Liam, but whatever happens, we'll figure it out together." Liam smiled at that, and for a moment, Alexander felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. Clara's message was clear: her love for their son, her belief in Alexander's ability to step into his role, and her hope for Liam's future. And now, standing at the threshold of answers and redemption, Alexander vowed not to let either of them down. Back at the orphanage, Miss Evelyn met them at the door. "How did it go?" she asked. "It helped," Alexander said, "but there's still more to uncover." "There always is," Miss Evelyn said knowingly. "But you're making progress. That's what matters." As Alexander watched Liam run off to play with the other children, he felt a quiet determination settle within him. He didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time he felt like he was on the right path. The sun dipped low over the orphanage, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and pink. Alexander stood on the porch, watching Liam play with the other children. The boy's laughter echoed through the yard, his energy boundless, as he chased a makeshift kite one of the older kids had crafted. But Alexander's mind was far from at ease. The day's revelations churned within him, refusing to settle. Ms. Evelyn joined him, carrying 2 steaming mugs of tea. She handed one to Alexander and leaned against the railing. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world," she said gently. Alexander sipped the tea, its warmth doing little to ease the knot in his chest. "It feels that way," he admitted. "I've spent years avoiding the past, convincing myself that burying it was the only way to move forward. And now—" He gestured toward Liam, who was shrieking with delight as the kite soared higher. "Now it's all come back, and I don't know where to start." Ms. Evelyn gave him a thoughtful look. "The past has a way of catching up with us, whether we're ready or not. But the fact that you're here, facing it, that says a lot." "I'm not sure it's enough," Alexander said, his voice heavy. "Clara trusted me with Liam's future, and I failed her once already." "You didn't know," Ms. Evelyn said softly. "And now you do. That's what matters." Alexander stared into the mug, the steam curling upward like a whisper of something fleeting. "Do you think it's possible to make up for lost time?" She placed a hand on his arm, her voice firm. "I think love has a way of filling in the gaps." As if on cue, Liam bounded up the steps, his cheeks flushed and his hair sticking up in wild tufts. "Did you see that, Mr. Blake?" he asked breathlessly. "The kite went all the way over the tree." "I saw," Alexander said, a small smile breaking through his somber expression. "You're pretty good at this." Liam grinned, the kind of grin that could light up even the darkest corners of a person's heart. "Can you help me fix the tail? It keeps flopping around." "Of course," Alexander said, setting his mug down. "Let's see what we can do." The two of them worked side by side on the kite, Liam chattering away about everything and nothing. For a boy who had spent so much of his life wondering where he came from, he had an uncanny ability to live in the moment. Alexander found himself marveling at it, at the way Liam's innocence and hopefulness seemed untouched by the hardships he had faced. As they finished the repairs, Liam held up the kite proudly. "It's perfect now," he declared. "It sure is," Alexander said, though he was no longer looking at the kite. His gaze lingered on Liam, and for the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a future, not just for the boy, but for both of them. A future where he could be the father Liam needed. That night, as the children settled into bed, Alexander sat in Ms. Evelyn's office, poring over the folder Margaret had given them. He traced the words of Clara's note with his fingers, her handwriting sparking 1,000 memories. But it was the question of why she had been afraid, what had driven her to leave Liam, that wouldn't leave his mind. The answer came sooner than he expected. There was a knock at the office door. Miss Evelyn opened it to find a man standing there, his suit crisp and his demeanor cold. He introduced himself as a private investigator and handed Miss Evelyn a card. "I've been hired to locate a boy named Liam," the man said flatly. "I have reason to believe he's here." Alexander froze, his mind racing. "Who hired you?" he demanded, stepping forward. The investigator raised an eyebrow. "That's confidential." Ms. Evelyn's expression darkened. "This is a private facility. You can't just walk in here and start making demands." The man gave a tight smile. "I don't want trouble. I just need confirmation that the boy is here. My client has been searching for him for years." Alexander's fists clenched. Whoever this client was, they had no right to Liam. And yet, the investigator's words brought a chill to his spine. Had Clara's fears been justified? Had someone been searching for her and Liam all this time? "You're not getting anything without proper authorization," Ms. Evelyn said firmly, her voice unwavering. The man's smile faltered, and he placed the card on her desk. "I'll be back," he said, before turning and leaving as abruptly as he had arrived. Alexander stared at the card, his heart pounding. He didn't recognize the name, but the implications were clear. Someone had been looking for Liam, and they weren't likely to stop now. Ms. Evelyn glanced at him, her eyes filled with concern. It seems Clara was running from something after all. Alexander nodded, the weight of the moment sinking in. He had been right to come here, to protect Liam. But now, it wasn't just about uncovering the past. It was about keeping Liam safe from whatever shadows had been chasing Clara. And for the first time, Alexander realized just how far he was willing to go to protect the boy who had already become the center of his world. The atmosphere in the orphanage had shifted after the investigator's visit. Miss Evelyn's usual calm was tinged with unease, and Alexander's resolve had hardened into something steely and immovable. Liam, blissfully unaware of the encounter, spent the next morning playing with his friends, his laughter ringing through the halls. But Alexander knew it was only a matter of time before the investigator returned, or worse, whoever had hired him might show up themselves. Alexander couldn't let that happen. He sat with Ms. Evelyn in her small office, the card the investigator had left sitting ominously on the desk between them. The man's name, Edward Graves, was printed in bold, unfeeling letters, accompanied by a phone number and the name of a private agency. "Who do you think he's working for?" Ms. Evelyn asked, her tone low. Alexander shook his head. "I don't know, but whoever it is, they've been searching for Liam for a long time. Clara must have known this was coming. That's why she left him here, to keep him out of their reach." Ms. Evelyn sighed, folding her hands tightly in her lap. But why? What could she have been running from? Alexander leaned back, his jaw tightening. Clara wasn't the type to scare easily. Whatever it was, it must have been serious. But I'm not going to let them take Liam. He's safe here, and I'll make sure it stays that way. "You'll have to be careful," Ms. Evelyn warned. "If they come back with legal authority, we may not have a choice." Alexander's mind raced. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew he couldn't rely on the system to protect Liam. The investigator's arrival confirmed one thing: Liam's safety wasn't guaranteed anymore. "I'll find out who they are," Alexander said firmly, "and why they're after him. But in the meantime, we need to prepare." Ms. Evelyn nodded, her expression grave. "I'll do what I can on my end. We'll make sure Liam is protected, no matter what." That afternoon, Alexander called the number on the card from a burner phone he picked up in town. He stood outside the orphanage, pacing as the phone rang. Finally, a clipped voice answered on the other end. "Edward Graves." "This is Alexander Blake," he said, keeping his tone calm but authoritative. "You visited the orphanage yesterday, looking for a boy named Liam." There was a pause. Then Graves replied, "I remember. What can I do for you, Mr. Blake?" "You can start by telling me who hired you." "I'm afraid I can't disclose that information," Graves said, his voice impassive. "It's confidential." Alexander clenched his teeth. "You showed up uninvited, demanding information about a child under my care. If you don't tell me who you're working for, I'll ensure you never set foot near that orphanage again." There was another pause, longer this time. Then Graves spoke, his tone more measured. "All I can tell you is that my client is a woman claiming to have a familial connection to the boy. She's been looking for him for years." "A familial connection?" Alexander repeated, his stomach sinking. "Yes, she provided detailed information about the boy's birth and the circumstances of his mother's disappearance. She seems credible." Alexander's grip on the phone tightened. If this woman was who he thought she might be, it could mean trouble, not just for Liam, but for himself as well. "What's her name?" "I'm sorry, Mr. Blake. That's all I can say." Alexander hung up without another word. His mind churned with possibilities. Could Clara have had a sister or another relative he didn't know about? Or was this woman simply lying, trying to gain access to Liam for some other purpose? Either way, he couldn't ignore the threat. When he returned to the orphanage, he found Liam sitting under the oak tree, his small hands carefully tying string to a paper plane he'd made. The boy looked up as Alexander approached, a wide smile spreading across his face. "Look," Liam said proudly, holding up the plane. "It's going to fly really far this time." Alexander crouched beside him, his heart aching with a mixture of love and fear. "It looks great, Liam. I bet it'll fly higher than all the others." Liam grinned, his confidence unshakable. "Want to see?" "Of course," Alexander said, forcing a smile. As Liam ran to launch the plane, Alexander watched him, his mind a whirlwind of plans and possibilities. He had to find out who this woman was and what she wanted. And more than that, he had to make sure Liam stayed safe, no matter what it took. Later that evening, as Liam slept, Alexander sat in the dim light of Ms. Evelyn's office, poring over everything he knew. The note from Clara, the records Margaret had provided, and now the cryptic information from the investigator. One thing was clear: Clara had left Liam behind to protect him. But from what or whom remained a mystery. "I need to find her," Alexander said aloud, his voice steady. Miss Evelyn looked up from her paperwork, her brow furrowed. "Find who?" "The woman Graves mentioned," Alexander replied. "If she's claiming to have a connection to Liam, I need to know why." Ms. Evelyn's gaze softened. "You're taking on a lot, Alexander. Are you sure you're ready for this?" "I have to be," he said simply. "Liam needs me, and I won't let him down." Ms. Evelyn nodded, her expression resolute. "Then we'll figure it out. Together." As the night deepened, Alexander felt the weight of the journey ahead pressing down on him. But he also felt something else, a quiet determination that no matter what lay ahead, he would fight for Liam with everything he had. For Clara's sake, for Liam's, and perhaps for his own. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, but the sense of unease from the previous day lingered like a cloud over the orphanage. Alexander woke early, his mind already working through the steps he needed to take. The card from Edward Graves burned a hole in his pocket as he paced the orphanage's courtyard, replaying their conversation over and over in his head. A familial connection, a woman searching for Liam. But why now? And why hadn't Clara mentioned anyone in her notes? He couldn't ignore the possibility that this woman might be lying. The stakes were too high to take her at face value. If she truly had Liam's best interests at heart, why had she sent a private investigator instead of coming forward herself? Determined to find answers, Alexander made a call to his own connections. Years of building a powerful business had earned him more than a few favors, and he was prepared to call in every single one of them to protect Liam. By mid-morning, Liam was outside again, playing with a small group of children near the oak tree. He waved at Alexander enthusiastically, and Alexander waved back, his chest tightening. Every moment he spent with the boy only deepened his resolve to keep him safe. Ms. Evelyn appeared beside him, her expression laced with concern. "You've been on edge since that investigator showed up," she said. "Did you find out anything?" Alexander nodded, his voice low. "He claims a woman with a familial connection is looking for Liam. I don't know who she is, but I'm going to find out." Ms. Evelyn frowned. If she's lying, she's dangerous. But if she's telling the truth, what if she's someone who could help Liam? Someone Clara trusted? "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Alexander replied, his tone resolute. "But until I know for sure, I can't take any chances." As if on cue, Alexander's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, a message from one of his investigators, a man he had tasked with looking into Edward Graves's client. The message was short but jarring. "Found her. Name is Isabel Morgan. Possible connection to Clara Morgan. Call me for details." Clara's last name. Alexander's breath caught in his throat as he reread the message. He hadn't known much about Clara's family. She had been private about her past, and he had never pressed her for details. But now that missing piece of her life had come crashing into his. "Isabel Morgan," he murmured aloud. Ms. Evelyn tilted her head. "Do you know her?" "No," Alexander said, "but she shares Clara's last name. It could be her sister or another relative." Ms. Evelyn's expression softened. If that's true, she might have information about why Clara left Liam here. She might even know where Clara is now. Or she might be after something else entirely, Alexander said darkly. "I need to know her motives before I let her anywhere near Liam." Ms. Evelyn nodded. "What's your next move?" "I'll meet her," Alexander said, "but on my terms." That evening, Alexander arranged a meeting with Isabel through his investigator. He chose a neutral location, a quiet coffee shop in the heart of the city. When he arrived, Isabel was already there, seated at a corner table. She looked up as he approached, and Alexander was struck by her resemblance to Clara. the same piercing green eyes, the same delicate features. But where Clara had been warm and full of life, Isabel's expression was sharp, guarded. "Alexander Blake," she said as he sat down, her voice measured. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you." "Isabel Morgan," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. "You've been looking for Liam." She nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I have. He's my nephew." The words hit Alexander like a punch to the chest. Nephew. If she was telling the truth, that confirmed it. Clara had a sister, a family he'd never known about. "Why now?" he asked, leaning forward. "Why are you looking for him after all these years?" Isabel's gaze didn't waver. "Because I didn't know he existed until recently. Clara never told me she had a child. I only found out after her death." Alexander froze. "Clara's gone?" Isabel's lips pressed into a thin line. "She passed away 2 years ago. Cancer. By the time I learned about Liam, it was too late to ask her anything." The world seemed to tilt beneath Alexander's feet. Clara was gone. The woman who had once been his whole world, who had left him behind to raise their son alone, was gone. A wave of guilt and grief washed over him, but he pushed it aside, focusing on the woman in front of him. "If you're telling the truth, why did you send a private investigator instead of coming yourself?" he asked, his voice tight. "I wanted to confirm he was safe before I made any contact," Isabel said firmly. "I've spent the past 2 years trying to find him, trying to piece together why Clara left him behind. And now that I've found him, I want to make sure he's cared for. That's all." Alexander studied her, searching for any hint of deception. She seemed genuine, but he couldn't afford to let his guard down. "I'm not going to let you take him," he said, his tone firm. "Liam is safe where he is, and I'm not going to let anyone disrupt that." Isabel's expression softened, and for the first time Alexander saw a flicker of sadness in her eyes. "I don't want to take him, Mr. Blake. I just want to know him, to give him a connection to the family he never had." The words hung in the air, and Alexander's resolve wavered. Could he trust her? Could he allow her into Liam's life without risking everything Clara had worked so hard to protect? "I'll think about it," he said finally, standing. "But if I find out you're lying or that you have any ulterior motives, I won't hesitate to protect Liam. Do you understand?" Isabel nodded. "I wouldn't expect anything less." As Alexander left the cafe, his mind was a storm of emotions. Clara was gone. Liam had an aunt. And the questions that had haunted him were only growing deeper. But one thing was certain. He wasn't done fighting for the boy who had become his reason to keep going. The revelation of Clara's death hung heavily on Alexander as he returned to the orphanage. He didn't sleep that night, instead sitting by the window of his room, staring out at the moonlit yard where Liam had played just hours earlier. The boy's laughter, his boundless energy, his unshakable hope, they all seemed even more fragile now. Clara was gone, and Alexander was all Liam had left of his mother. The next morning, Alexander sat at the breakfast table with Liam, who was busy stacking his toast into a lopsided tower. The boy's innocence was a stark contrast to the turmoil raging in Alexander's mind. Isabel's words echoed endlessly. "I just want to know him, to give him a connection to the family he never had." But could he trust her? "Mr. Blake?" Liam's voice broke through his thoughts. Alexander blinked and looked at him. "Yes, Liam?" "You look sad," Liam said, tilting his head. "Are you okay?" Alexander forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm fine, just thinking." "About my mom?" Liam asked, his tone curious rather than accusatory. Alexander nodded, surprised by the boy's perception. "Yes, about your mom." Liam set his toast down, suddenly serious. "Do you think she would be proud of me?" Alexander's chest tightened. "More than anything," he said without hesitation. She loved you very much, Liam. She would be proud of the kind, brave boy you are. Liam smiled at that, his eyes shining. I hope so. Later that day, Alexander called Isabel, arranging a meeting at the orphanage. If she was going to be part of Liam's life, it needed to happen on his terms. Ms. Evelyn was hesitant but supportive, understanding that the decision ultimately lay with Alexander, and, to some extent, with Liam. When Isabel arrived, she was visibly nervous. Her polished demeanor from their first meeting had softened, and she seemed unsure of how to approach the boy she had only recently learned about. Alexander met her at the gate and led her to the courtyard, where Liam was playing with a group of children. Liam noticed them immediately and ran over, his eyes full of curiosity. He stopped short when he saw Isabel, his gaze darting between her and Alexander. "Who's this?" Liam asked, his tone cautious but polite. Alexander crouched beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Liam, this is Isabel Morgan. She's your mom's sister, your aunt." Liam's eyes widened, and he looked at Isabel with a mix of surprise and wonder. "My aunt?" he repeated, testing the word as if it were something foreign. Isabel knelt down, her voice gentle. "Hi, Liam. It's so nice to finally meet you. I've heard so many wonderful things about you." Liam tilted his head, studying her. "You knew my mom?" Isabel's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. "Yes, I knew her. She was my sister, and she loved you more than anything in the world." Liam's face softened, and he reached up to touch the necklace around his neck. "She gave me this," he said. "Do you remember it?" Isabel nodded, her voice trembling. "I do. She wore it all the time. She said it was her most special thing." Liam's small face lit up with pride. "It's mine now. I keep it safe, just like she told me." Alexander watched the exchange, his heart aching. He had been prepared to interrogate Isabel, to question her every motive, but seeing her with Liam, her genuine affection, her resemblance to Clara, he began to wonder if perhaps she truly did have Liam's best interests at heart. "Would you like to talk to her for a while?" Alexander asked Liam, his tone soft. Liam hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, can we sit under the tree?" "Of course," Isabel said, smiling through her tears. As they walked away, Alexander stayed behind, watching them from a distance. Isabel sat cross-legged on the grass, listening intently as Liam talked animatedly, his hands waving as he told her about his favorite games and his friends at the orphanage. For the first time, Alexander felt a flicker of hope that this connection might be a good thing for Liam. Miss Evelyn joined him, her expression thoughtful. "What do you think?" she asked. Alexander sighed. "I don't know yet, but she seems genuine." "She does," Miss Evelyn agreed. "Sometimes family shows up when you least expect it." Alexander nodded but said nothing. His instincts had been honed through years of navigating the cutthroat world of business, and he wasn't ready to let his guard down completely. Still, as he watched Liam laugh and play with his newfound aunt, he couldn't deny that something had shifted. For the first time, the boy had a tangible connection to his mother's past, a piece of the puzzle he had been missing. When the sun began to set, Isabel said her goodbyes, promising to visit again soon. As she walked to her car, Alexander caught up with her. "Thank you for coming," he said, his tone cautious but sincere. Isabel turned to him, her expression earnest. "Thank you for giving me the chance. I don't want to disrupt Liam's life. I just want to be there for him, however I can." Alexander studied her for a moment, then nodded. "We'll see." As Isabel drove away, Alexander stood at the gate, the weight of the day settling over him. Liam ran up to him, his face glowing with excitement. "She's nice," he said simply. Alexander ruffled the boy's hair, a small smile playing on his lips. Yeah, she is. For the first time in years, Alexander felt the faintest stirrings of peace. The journey wasn't over, but for now, Liam was safe, surrounded by love, and that was all that mattered. The following days at the orphanage were a mix of cautious optimism and simmering tension. Isabel kept her word and visited regularly, each time bringing small gifts or stories about Clara that lit up Liam's face. She seemed genuine in her affection for him, but Alexander still couldn't shake his doubts. He spent hours in quiet contemplation, trying to balance his instinct to protect Liam with the possibility that Isabel could truly be a positive force in the boy's life. One evening, as Liam and Isabel sat under the oak tree, Alexander watched them from a distance. Liam was showing her the drawings he had made in art class, his voice animated as he described each one. Isabel listened attentively, occasionally laughing or asking questions that made Liam beam with pride. It was a side of her that felt real, unguarded. Miss Evelyn approached Alexander, her gaze following his. "You're still watching her like a hawk," she said lightly. "I have to," Alexander replied. "I can't take chances." Miss Evelyn sighed, crossing her arms. "I understand your hesitation, but from where I stand, she seems to care deeply about Liam. That boy deserves to have a connection to his family." Alexander frowned. "You're right. He deserves that, but I need to be sure it's safe. Clara left him here for a reason." Miss Evelyn nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the only way to know is to take a leap of faith." Alexander remained silent, his eyes fixed on Liam. A leap of faith. The very idea made his stomach churn, but deep down, he knew Miss Evelyn was right. He couldn't protect Liam from everything, and if Isabel truly was the family she claimed to be, cutting her out of his life could do more harm than good. That night, Alexander sat alone in the orphanage's common room, the folder containing Clara's notes and records spread out before him. He had read every word a dozen times, searching for some clue, some hidden message that might explain her fears. But each time, he came up empty. As he leaned back in his chair, his phone buzzed. It was his investigator. "I found something," the man said without preamble. Alexander straightened. "What is it?" "Isabel Morgan checks out," the investigator continued. "No criminal record, no suspicious activity. She's exactly who she says she is, a schoolteacher with no children of her own. She's been trying to find Liam since Clara passed away." Alexander felt a small measure of relief, but the investigator wasn't finished. "There's something else, though," he said, his voice lowering. "Clara's death. It wasn't as straightforward as it seemed." Alexander's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "I dug into her medical records. She was diagnosed with cancer, but there are notes in her file suggesting she delayed treatment for months. By the time she sought help, it was too late. The doctors wrote that she seemed distracted. They mentioned she talked about protecting her son. I think she was afraid of something, or someone." Alexander's grip on the phone tightened. "Did you find out who?" "Not yet," the investigator admitted, "but I'm still looking. Whoever or whatever Clara was afraid of, it must have been serious. She sacrificed her health to keep Liam safe." Alexander ended the call, his mind racing. Clara had given up everything, her life, her health, her happiness, to protect their son. And yet, even now, the threat she had feared remained shrouded in mystery. The next day, Alexander decided it was time to confront Isabel directly. When she arrived at the orphanage, he pulled her aside before she could join Liam. "I need to talk to you," he said, his tone firm. Isabel looked surprised, but nodded. "Of course." They sat in the office, the tension thick between them. Alexander leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "I've been doing some digging," he began. "About Clara, about why she left Liam here." Isabel's expression softened. "She wanted to protect him," she said simply. I don't know the details, but I know she was afraid. She told me once, years ago, that she felt like she was always looking over her shoulder. Did she ever tell you who she was afraid of? Alexander pressed. No, Isabel admitted, her eyes clouding with sadness. She never shared much about her past, but I know she was running from something or someone. Alexander studied her carefully. If that's true, then Liam could still be in danger. I need to know if you're prepared to help me protect him, no matter what. Isabel met his gaze, her voice steady. I am. He's my family too, Alexander. I'll do whatever it takes. Alexander leaned back, her words settling over him like a cautious balm. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that Isabel might be an ally rather than a threat. That evening, as the children gathered for story time, Alexander sat beside Liam on the rug. Isabel joined them, her presence now familiar and unintrusive. Liam leaned against Alexander, his small fingers clutching the necklace around his neck. The boy's trust was palpable, and Alexander felt its weight as both a responsibility and a gift. As the story ended and the children began to drift off to bed, Liam turned to Alexander. Do you think my mom would be happy that Aunt Isabel found me? He asked. Alexander smiled softly, his voice thick with emotion. I think she'd be very happy, Liam. She wanted you to be loved, and you are. Liam nodded, his face thoughtful. I miss her, but I think she's still watching, like she's making sure we're okay. Alexander's heart ached with both grief and hope. I think you're right. As Liam drifted off to sleep, nestled against Alexander's side, Isabel approached quietly. He's a remarkable boy, she said softly. He is, Alexander agreed, and I'll do whatever it takes to make sure he stays safe. Isabel nodded, her eyes brimming with determination. So will I. For the first time, Alexander felt the faintest flicker of trust. Together, they would uncover the truth about Clara's past and ensure that whatever had haunted her would never touch Liam. The morning dawned clear and crisp, a rare moment of peace settling over the orphanage. The tension of the previous weeks had eased slightly, though Alexander knew it was only temporary. There were still too many unanswered questions about Clara's past, about the fears that had driven her to leave Liam at the orphanage. But today, as Liam sat at the breakfast table chattering about his plans to build a new kite, Alexander allowed himself a moment of quiet gratitude. For now, Liam was safe, surrounded by love and laughter. Later that afternoon, a call from Alexander's investigator shattered the fragile calm. I've found something, the man said, his tone urgent. Clara wasn't just afraid of someone, she was being followed. Records show she filed a police report 2 months before leaving Liam at the orphanage. She reported a man who had been harassing her, demanding to know where her son was. Alexander's chest tightened. Did she give a name? She didn't know his full identity, the investigator replied. But there's a note in the report mentioning a connection to someone Clara used to work with, a man named Victor Kane. The name sent a chill through Alexander. He vaguely remembered Clara mentioning Kane during their time together, a former business associate of hers who had a reputation for underhanded dealings. If Kane had been the one pursuing Clara, it was clear why she had been so afraid. Do you have any leads on him? Alexander asked. Kane disappeared years ago, but there's a record of recent activity under an alias. It's possible he's still looking for Liam. Alexander's grip on the phone tightened. Keep digging. I want to know everything. That evening, Alexander sat in the common room with Ms. Evelyn and Isabel, explaining what he had learned. Isabel's face paled as he recounted the details. Victor Kane, she murmured. I remember Clara mentioning him once. She said he was dangerous, but she didn't tell me why. Ms. Evelyn frowned. If he's still out there, then Liam might not be as safe as we thought. Alexander nodded. We need to be prepared. If Kane comes here, we have to make sure he doesn't get anywhere near Liam." "Agreed," Isabel said firmly. "Whatever it takes." The three of them spent hours discussing precautions, from tightening security at the orphanage to alerting local authorities. But as the night wore on, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The next day, their fears were confirmed. A black car was spotted parked outside the orphanage gates, its windows tinted, the engine idling. Ms. Evelyn alerted Alexander immediately, her voice trembling. "It's him," she whispered. "It has to be." Alexander didn't hesitate. He stepped outside, his heart pounding, and approached the car. The driver's window rolled down slowly, revealing a man with sharp features and cold eyes. "Alexander Blake," the man said, his voice smooth and calculating. "You're a hard man to track down." Alexander's jaw tightened. "What do you want?" "I'm here for the boy," the man said bluntly. "Liam?" "Over my dead body," Alexander snapped, his voice like steel. The man chuckled, though there was no humor in the sound. "You don't understand. This isn't about you. It's about unfinished business with his mother." Alexander stepped closer, his anger boiling over. "Clara's gone and Liam is under my protection. If you think for a second that I'll let you near him, you're sorely mistaken." The man's expression darkened. "You don't know what you're dealing with, Blake, but you'll find out soon enough." With that, he rolled up the window and drove off, the car disappearing down the road. Alexander stood frozen, his fists clenched, his mind racing. Kane, or whoever this man was, had made his intentions clear. The danger was real, and it was closer than ever. That evening, as Liam slept peacefully in his bed, Alexander sat with Isabel and Ms. Evelyn in the office. The weight of the situation pressed down on all of them, but Alexander refused to let fear dictate his actions. "We need to get ahead of this," he said firmly. "If Kane thinks he can intimidate us, he's wrong. I'll do whatever it takes to protect Liam." "We'll stand with you," Isabel said, her voice unwavering. "Clara would want us to." Ms. Evelyn nodded. "This is his home, and we won't let anyone take that from him." Alexander felt a surge of determination. Together they would stand against whatever threats came their way. Liam had already lost so much, his mother, his sense of security. But Alexander would make sure he never lost the one thing that mattered most, a family that loved him. The final confrontation came 2 days later. Kane returned, this time with 2 men in tow, their intentions clear. But Alexander was ready. With the help of Ms. Evelyn, Isabel, and local authorities he had quietly involved, they confronted Kane head-on. The man underestimated their resolve, and within minutes, police officers arrived to arrest him. The threat was neutralized, and Liam's safety was assured. For now. In the days that followed, peace returned to the orphanage. Alexander spent more time with Liam than ever, helping him build kites, telling him stories about his mother, and watching as the boy flourished under the love and care of the people around him. Isabel became a regular presence, her bond with Liam growing stronger with each passing day. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Liam sat beside Alexander on the porch steps, his small hand resting in Alexander's larger one. "Do you think my mom's happy now?" Liam asked, looking up at him. Alexander smiled softly, his heart swelling with both love and sadness. "I think she's very happy, Liam. She loved you more than anything, and she'd be so proud of you." Liam leaned against him, his voice quiet. "I think she sent you to me." Alexander wrapped an arm around the boy, pulling him close. "Maybe she did. And I'm glad she did, because you're the best thing that ever happened to me." As the stars began to twinkle in the sky, Alexander felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The journey had been long, and the wounds of the past might never fully heal. But he knew one thing for certain. He had found his purpose. And together, he and Liam would build a future filled with love, hope, and second chances.